when I look at Trudeau, there's a couple of things that I see. I see someone who hasn't grown up. I mean, one of the most appalling things about the budget, as far as I was concerned, is that it provides ample evidence, if such was not sufficiently provided already, that Trudeau is exactly what you would be afraid of if you were afraid of him. He doesn't have an answer to a problem that isn't overwhelmingly predictable ideologically. It's like you don't even need him. You just have to run the ideology. It has the answers. What's the big problem? Equity between men and women. It's like, sorry, that's not the big problem. That's not even, you're not even scratching the surface of the problem with that approach. And your solutions, it's like you can learn those solutions your first week in women's studies. They're not solutions. They're the sorts of solutions that children toy with when they have no idea what they're contending with. Yeah, well, there's not a lot there, I'm afraid. Fixing these complex systems is unbelievably complicated, and you're likely to make them worse when you're mucking about with them haphazardly, right? And so it's way easier just to do this. Trudeau said it back in, wasn't it 2016? Why are half the cabinet women? Because it's 2000 and, was it 16 or 15? Yeah. Well, it's almost impossible to overstate how shallow that comment is, and how not only shallow, but it's also casually malevolent in an unconscious sense, because he had a job to do, which was to evaluate his MPs thoroughly and skeptically and pick the best people, period. But that isn't what he did. He said, oh, well, it's 2016, so I'll appoint half women. It's like, well, everybody gave him a pass on that, and so here we are. Now we have a budget that's equity-focused. Yeah, well, good luck with that. When I look at Trudeau, there's a couple of things that I see. I see someone who hasn't grown up. So he's Peter Pan. I see someone he knows how to behave in public. That's one thing you can say about him. He's got that easy charisma and charm that comes from being good-looking, being from a favored background, the favored background that he's from. He's got by on that. And the reason I believe that is because I don't believe that if he had any true character that he would have run, because he ran on the strength of his name, and he hadn't earned the right to do that. But people elected him, so here we are. And this is what we get. I mean, he pulled out the ideological card when he formulated the cabinet, and Canadians all went, oh, isn't that cute? It's like, no, it's not cute. It's not acceptable. And now we're paying the price for it. You know, they'd repaired the relationship. Well, that's the purpose. It's like when I go places now and people come to talk to me, that happens all the time.
I'd like to start with 12 rules. You call it an antidote to chaos. It sounds more like you're in that zone where you are somewhere between rule-bound and chaos. You're trying to, as an individual, navigate that path. How can an individual change without falling into chaos?
Well, part of it is that you don't want to bite off more than you can chew. You know, you should try to change something that is difficult, but where you have a moderate probability of succeeding. Or if you're feeling depressed and anxious, a fairly high probability of succeeding. So you have to, it's just as if you're dealing with a child, let's say. When you want to foster the development of a child, you set them a new task so that their skills expand. You don't want it to be so difficult that their probability of failure is overwhelming. There's no utility in that. But you don't want it to be so easy that they can already do it, right? And that it's also partly you don't want it to be so easy because there's no intrinsic joy of mastery in mastering a task that's too easy. So if you calibrate it properly, then you get to have your cake and eat it too, right? Because the skill expands. That's called the zone of proximal development. That was discovered by a Russian psychologist named Vygotsky. He was a very good psychologist. And one of the things he noted was that adults automatically talk to children at a level that slightly exceeds their current comprehension ability. We do that we don't have to be taught to do that. We do that automatically. And obviously we'd have to do that because otherwise children wouldn't learn how to talk. But you want to have yourself in the zone of proximal development all the time, really. Well, maybe not when you're relaxing, but generally you want to be in a place that you've reasonably well mastered, while at the same time extending your skills. It's optimal because then things are under control and turning out the way you need and want them to, but your ability to master new areas is also growing. And I would say that's associated with people's intrinsic sense of meaning. You know, the meaning is a real instinct, as far as I can tell, neurologically speaking, and it signals that not only are you somewhere that's working, but that you're getting better at the same time. So that's what an athlete does when he or she pushes past a limit, you know. You don't want to hurt yourself, obviously, but you don't want to just stay, and you don't want to hurt yourself, and you don't want to be somewhere where you're completely incompetent. You want to be somewhere secure but challenging. And that's what makes your life meaningful.
But perhaps that's an antidote to modern parenting that you're proposing. A lot of you talk in the book about how happiness is not a reasonable goal, not a
it's a shallow goal, because, well, the problem with happiness is that there's lots of times you're not going to be happy. I mean, life is hard. You don't have to scratch. This is one thing you learn as a clinical psychologist very rapidly, but I think people know this anyways. You don't have to scratch very far below the surface in most people's lives to find a pretty damn deep well of tragedy. And not only tragedy, but often malevolence, sometimes on their part, but sometimes because they've been subject to betrayal and abuse and scandal and all sorts of things. There's virtually no one who doesn't have that deeply embedded into their narrative. It's like happiness doesn't address that. You know, you need a reason to keep you going when things are falling apart around you, because there's going to be a lot of your life where, you know, you have a sick parent, or you have a sick child, or your health isn't good yourself, or your marriage is unstable at the moment, or you're dealing with a financial crisis, or like, it's just one thing after another. Everyone knows this. And so meaning is a much more robust antidote than happiness. Happiness is great, man. If it comes along, it's like, welcome it, you know, and be grateful for it. But it's a side effect and not a goal.
Can I ask about why the 12 rules? You mentioned that you had started helping people online. I think you wrap up the book by saying you hope that this is useful to people. Mm-hmm. Your book is topping on the Amazon charts. Your audiences are quite large.
New York Times doesn't approve of it, though.
Okay, all right then. But yeah. Others do. And so, what was your purpose? What was your goal in this book?
Well, I'll tell you a story. So I was in LA 3 weeks ago, and I had given a talk there, and I was walking down the street the next day, and this kid pulled up beside me in a car and hopped out, and he was a Latino kid, probably 19 or 20. He popped over, and he was all happy to see me and sort of bouncing around, and he said that he'd been listening to my lectures a lot, and then he said, you know, it's really straightened out my relationship with my dad, really a lot. And then he said, just wait a minute, and then he ran back to the car, and he got his dad out. And then they stood there and like they had their arms around each other. And well, they were both extremely happy. You know, they'd repaired the relationship. Well, that's the purpose. It's like when I go places now and people come to talk to me, that happens all the time. It's like, that's great.
Are you surprised?
Couldn't be better. That's so good. It was so fun to see that, you know, and they were genuine about it. So, yeah, that's really good.
Are you surprised by that? When you wrote it and sat down to write it, did you envision that you would be getting that type of reaction and this type of response?
Well, certainly not at this scale. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, I had taught this course called Maps of Meaning, which was based on my first book, and it also had an influence on my personality course. And I got a lot of student feedback on that course. You know, I've been teaching it since 1993, and the vast majority of the feedback was, this course changed my life. And I knew that I was dealing with things that were fundamental. I was aiming to deal with things that were fundamental. You know, I'm aiming to deal with tragedy and malevolence, and those are fundamental. And so I knew that, and you know, the work that I've done incorporates a lot of the wisdom of some of the greatest thinkers of the 19th and 20th century, the clinicians in particular. There were some great clinicians in the 20th century, you know, like there's a dozen of them probably, maybe more. And a lot of what they learned is really helpful. Like if you read, like Carl Rogers is a good example. I talk about him in Chapter 9, Rule 9, which is assume that the person that you're listening to knows something you don't. And there's very practical advice there in how to conduct a conversation with an intimate partner. And one of the rules is, well, listen, because would you want to have the same damn argument for the rest of your life? It's like, listen, you're not there to win the argument, because you have to live with that person. So winning is a really bad strategy. Peace is a good strategy. Well, so you listen to them and then you tell them back what they said. And if they agree with you, well, then you've got it. At least they know you've heard them. That's something. And it also stops you from being able to turn them into a straw man. And, if you really do it intelligently, maybe you happen to be better verbally than your partner. Doesn't mean you're right. Just means you're better verbally. And so if they've got something to tell you, well, then maybe you also have to help them restate their argument so that it's even stronger. You think, well, why in the world would I do that? And the answer is, well, you got a lot of days coming up, and maybe you don't want to have the same fight every day. I had a client at one point who was spending about 45 minutes a night putting his son to sleep, 4 years old, something like that. And this is very common. And we did a little bit of arithmetic. I often do that with my clients. It's like, okay, let's call that 5 hours a week, 20 hours a month, 240 hours a year. That's 6 work weeks of time in a year you're spending fighting with your son. It's like, what do you expect from that? You're not going to like each other. You can't fight with someone 6 work weeks in a year and not have that hurt both of you. It's like, you got to solve it. You got to figure out what the problem is. You got to make it go away. So one of the things that it's hard for people to grasp conceptually is that the mundane things that you do every day are your life. And you want to get those right. And people don't pay attention to those things. They're usually looking for the exceptions, like the vacation or the special occasion. It's like, You want to figure out how, when you come home, people greet you so that you're welcome in your own house. Because you do that like 3 times a day. You get that down, it's like that's 45 minutes of each day. That's like 10% of your life right there. You fix that, it's 10% of your life. Meal times, things you repeat. You want to get those pristine. And that Carl Jung said that people in the modern world don't see God because they don't look low enough, which is he's so brilliant, such a brilliant idea. But it has to do with this willingness to contend with the hypothetically mundane realities of day-to-day life. Whatever happens day-to-day is not mundane. It's quite a day is not mundane. It's on a few very narrow ideological tracks. We saw the first evidence of that when he put his cabinet together. He insisted upon making it 50% women, despite the fact that only about 22% of the elected MPs were women. And it was easier for him to do that than it was for him to screen people for the sort of competence that would actually be necessary to be cabinet members. So we've seen a fair bit of this behavior, but that was the most egregious example, I suppose.
Dr. Peterson, I recall you taking some heat because you said you would refuse to use these gender-neutral pronouns. Why was that?
Well, I actually said that I would refuse to use the pronouns that were mandated by law because they were mandated by law. I feel that it's completely inappropriate of the government to decide what language the citizenry should speak. There's never been an example of that in British common law history, and I believe that that was a very, very bad precedent. I didn't want to use language that I thought was generated by radical leftist propagandists, and so I said I wouldn't do it.
I saw one tweet this morning that said Neil Armstrong should have said one small step for peoplekind.
Yeah, well, you know, Trudeau was listening to an earnest woman try to discuss something important, and he interjected a ideological statement in the middle of the dialogue, and that indicates, I think, precisely the way he thinks. And I don't think he does think. I think he runs an ideology in his head and accepts the output without question. And I think we're really going to pay for it in Canada in ways that we can't yet imagine.
Well, we're going to find out because you believe it's coming to us here in America, and you've been to both countries frequently. Now let's talk about something else that builds on your premise. This whole father-daughter dance that are being canceled around the country because of gender guidelines. Even Donald Trump Jr. weighed in with this quote: the father-daughter dances inherently leave people out, not just because of transgender status, just life in general. These can be really uncomfortable, triggering events. That, according to Jared Fox, New York City Department of Education. So that's their response to cancel the dance because there's a lot of people that can't go. Is there a problem with that?
Well, the problem with that is self-evident, but it's part of this absolute onslaught by the radical leftists on the fundamental normative structures of our culture. And if you're going to cancel everything that's triggering to everyone, then you're going to cancel everything altogether, because there isn't a single thing that anyone can ever say or do that isn't going to offend someone. And the idea that this is being done so that certain people's feelings won't be hurt, I think, is absolutely absurd. It's not compassion and care that's driving this. It's the desire to put forward a very pernicious ideology, and it's being very, very successful in its application.
But Dr. Peterson, they say that they're doing that to make things more inclusive.
Yeah, well, they say all sorts of things, and they are a very small, noisy, dangerous minority, and it's really appalling that we're bending over backwards to do their bidding without question, under the name of compassion.
A lot of my friends have been posting pictures of the daddy-daughter dance recently, and I think the pictures are so cute. Are little girls going to miss out on a memory?
Well, yes, for sure. And the thing is that even your terminology, when you're talking about little girls, is something that's going to be increasingly forbidden.
The professor joins us on the line. Jordan Peterson, good morning to you.
Good morning.
He must have been kidding, wasn't he?
No.
No.
No, and his new budget is completely focused on equity.
I mean,
and
how?
That's the problem he thinks he needs to solve in Canada. That's the limit of his imagination, is to construct an entire federal budget to solve a problem that no one cares about, that doesn't exist.
Well, I think this country's rapidly charging down the same road. I know you've not been in the country for very long, but you're here at a sold-out speaking tour. We've had the Gender and Language Police in the last week, the Diversity Council of all things, suggesting that airline staff can't use the words sir and madam. I had to say, Jordan, I was very happy when the next day I got on a flight and the flight attendant said, "Watch out for your arm, Dahl, because I'm going to bang into it with a trolley." So sensible people are not taking any notice of this stuff, are they?
Yeah, but they will. You guys are on the same road that we're on in Canada, and it's worse than you think. So be prepared, because it's coming.
So tell me about the book. What motivated you to write 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos, and what does the book tell us?
Well, I'm trying to outline an alternative, I wouldn't say political path exactly, I would say an ethical path. You know, we're on this journey in the West into identity politics, which is a terrible thing. It's a terrible thing on the left to re-divide us into tribal groups and to set us against one another, you know, all in the name of oppression and victimization. Or on the right, to set us against one another in the name of nationalism and ethnic pride. You know, the identity politics game is tribalism, and playing that game is murderous, and it's as simple as that. And I've been trying to outline an alternative, and it's a classic Western alternative, I would say, a classic Western liberal alternative, even in the old school sense. And I've been lecturing online and writing in this book as well about the idea that the best way forward is for people to straighten up and to adopt responsibility and to try to put their lives in order and to be very careful with their speech and to say what they mean and to act forthrightly, and so that we can return to our individual predicated society and try to negotiate between the two shoals of this political polarization process. And so the book is a series of stories and arguments to flesh out that idea that meaning in life, which is the antidote, the real antidote to chaos, I would say, is to be found in the adoption of responsibility and the willingness to struggle forward, regardless of your suffering, regardless of your victimization status, let's say. So,
well, I feel like I'm a victim. I'm an old white male. We seem to be the main targets.
Yeah, well, that's going to get worse before it gets better. So,
can't get much worse, can it?
Oh, yes.
Is it going to get worse?
Things can always get worse. There's no bottom to worse. So, yeah, well, I mean, these things are so foolish. I know your airline, Qantas, and this is something, it's absolutely remarkable to behold, in my estimation, is to see these corporations, which are obviously beneficiaries of the free West, free market system, allowing the radical leftists into their ranks to determine the linguistic territory that they're going to inhabit. And I don't know what corporate leaders are thinking. Why in the world would you let in a radical leftist fifth column in the midst of your company? How is that going to be a good idea?
But what I find in that is that the workforce themselves are sensible enough to ignore this.
Yeah, well, that's not going to be the case for long, because what you'll see is that people who ignore it will be called out by the radicals who support it, and they will become increasingly cowed and afraid to use their normative language.
Is this only happening in the West?
Yes, I would say so. I would say, as far as I can tell, that it's a Western phenomenon.
It doesn't seem to be happening in Asian countries, for example. It seems to be particularly bad in places like the UK, Canada, the United States and Australia. I spoke yesterday about a Mother's Day card. You won't believe this, Professor. In the UK, being sold at the giant Waitrose supermarket chain. Mother's Day cards that don't say Happy Mother's Day, it says Happy You Day.
That really, you'd be amazed at what doesn't surprise me anymore. I mean, people send me things all the time outlining the next idiotic step in the politically correct march, and every single thing is jaw-dropping. And it's like a contest in stupidity. And as soon as you think you've seen as far as it can go, someone pops up with something like you just described to show you that no, it can still get more foolish.